As we get towards the election in May, they've moved very slightly towards the Conservatives, but essentially it is really neck and neck, and it does seem very, very likely there will be a hung parliament, meaning no party has secured an overall majority. And then we get loads of speculation on who Labour or the Conservatives will work with. And yesterday, under some pressure on the question, Ed Miliband said no formal coalition with the Scottish National Party. So that's where we are so far. Of course, that doesn't stop Labour or the Conservatives having some kind of informal agreement with the SNP or one of the other parties just to keep the government going. But what if no agreement at all is possible or desirable? Could a party form a minority government? In other words, govern without having anything like half the number of MPs? We're joined again by the man who knows everything about the election except the result, Professor John Curtice. Thought I'd better say that. How are you?
Fine, Jeremy. Thank you very much for that. What glorious introduction.
Thank you. Now, the polls, just to start on that, they were exciting last time we met because there was a tiny lead for Labour. They're now even more exciting because there isn't one.
No, I think the truth is the Labour Party's lead probably disappeared during the course of the last 3 or 4 weeks. At the moment now, the average looks as though literally Tory 33, Labour 33. And the crucial thing about that is that it doesn't just simply mean, therefore, that it looks as though we're looking at a hung parliament. But on those kinds of figures, neither Labour nor the Conservatives are likely to be even close to the 326 mark, which is what they need for an overall majority. In other words, at the moment at least, and it's still 8 weeks to go, we're not just looking at a hung parliament, but perhaps a well and truly hung parliament.
So what happened last time? Let's just go through the numbers for simplicity. 650 MPs in the House of Commons. Therefore, you need half of them plus one to be a majority, which is 326. Last time, the Conservatives got 306, right?
307 if you include the Speaker.
OK, yeah. So that wasn't enough. They went in with the Lib Dems.
Yep.
You're thinking this time no one's going to get 326.
Mm-hmm.
So could they govern without going in with anybody, is the question.
Well, that's certainly possible. Of course, it's perfectly possible for somebody to form a minority government, so long as there are sufficient other parties who are willing not to vote that government out of office in a vote of confidence and to allow an initial Queen's speech to go through. So, for example, if we go back to the last time a general election produced a hung parliament back in February 1974, Harold Wilson only had 301 seats. He needed 316 then for a majority. Basically, he survived because the opposition weren't willing to gang up on him to force him out. And indeed, subsequently, the Labour Party lost its majority later in the 1970s. What they then did here, they didn't have a coalition, but they had an understanding with the then Liberal Party called the Lib Lab Pact. So they were a minority government that survived, although eventually it did all come unstuck in March 1979 when actually the government was defeated in a vote of confidence and we had a general election. But yes, governments can survive without half the votes, so long as the other parties are willing to allow them to stay there.
So we've got different grades of support. We've got the full coalition, which we have now. You then have the thing we had in the 70s, the Lib Lab Pact, which is, I understand the technical term is confidence and supply. Is that right?
That's correct. Basically, the idea is that a junior party says, OK, we will guarantee that you can get your finance bills through so you can pay your bills. We guarantee that we will support you in any vote of confidence in the House of Commons. And then perhaps, as in the case of the Lib Lab Pact, there's then some understanding that maybe the government will consult with this junior party about things that they're thinking of bringing forward, etc., etc. But there is no obligation on the smaller party to vote for the government on each and every piece of legislation, which does therefore mean that a minority government certainly is more vulnerable to losing legislation in the House of Commons. And again, if you look back to the experience of the 1970s when you last had a minority government, for example, Labour at that occasion couldn't even always get all the detailed clauses of its finance bill through. So its budget had to be changed because the House of Commons weren't willing to vote for it in its entirety.
OK, let us say then that the election day comes and the Conservatives are the biggest party, but they haven't got 326. So they're just above 300 and Labour are just below. And the Conservative Party thinks, OK, let's see if we can reconstitute the coalition. And they go to the Lib Dems and the Lib Dems, who, by the way, have lost Nick Clegg because he lost his seat, say take a running jump because Vince Cable doesn't really like them. So then they go to the SNP and you can imagine what they say. And the Tories are then in a situation where they are the biggest party, but no one will work with them. Now, can David Cameron say, I'm sorry, I'm not leaving number 10 because I won?
The answer to you is that David Cameron has the right, as the incumbent Prime Minister, to face the House of Commons, to present it with a Queen's speech and or to invite the House to express its confidence in his government and to see whether he survives or not. The clear precedent for this is back after the 1923 general election when Stanley Baldwin, the then Conservative Prime Minister, lost what had hitherto been an overall majority. He faced the House of Commons and he only resigned when in fact the House of Commons voted against him because the Liberals and the Labour Party voted him out, and then the Liberals enabled the Labour Party to form a minority government. So it's perfectly clear that the incumbent Prime Minister can try to remain in office if he or she wishes to do so. And to some degree, at least, therefore, there is no doubt that David Cameron has something of an advantage. Because certainly, if he's in a situation where he's not too far off, he can probably do a deal with the Democratic Unionists in Northern Ireland. That's another 8 or 9 seats. Nigel Farage might in the end be willing certainly not to vote against him, even if he hasn't necessarily got what he wants in terms of an earlier referendum. Sinn Féin, of course, won't turn up, so the real target's about 3-2-3. And if David Cameron reckons, you know what, actually the SNP and the Labour Party can't even come to some understanding for confidence to supply. I mean, the coalition's out the window. Actually, I've got to try my luck because actually, you know, that maybe that the Labour and the SNP won't vote me down because they can't themselves come to an agreement. So yes, he has something advantage. He can try to form an administration in a circumstance. The truth is, even if he doesn't have most seats, if he thinks he can survive, he has the right to try.
Okay, well, let's go to that scenario. Let's flip it round. So Labour have the most seats. They're on 305 now. They haven't got a majority. The Conservatives are somewhere below that 290, let's say. Let's not get hung up on the figures. And David Cameron says to Miliband, all right, what can you do? And Miliband can't go in with the SNP for reasons discussed, and the Lib Dems. And then so Cameron then says, okay, I came second, but I'm staying in Downing Street. Now, is that feasible?
Well, I think it's constitutionally feasible. Whether it's going to be politically feasible is another matter. I mean, I think the truth is nobody would expect David Cameron to remain in office in those circumstances unless he had reached understandings with other political parties that gave him good grounds to believe that he could get a Queen's speech through the House of Commons. So that, I think, implies that the Liberal Democrats perhaps have rather more seats than we're expecting at the moment and therefore perhaps can play a crucial role, and that maybe the support of the Liberal Democrats together with the DUP and maybe also UKIP abstaining, maybe Mr Cameron can just about make it. But I think what one should say, Jeremy, I think the crucial thing to realise, and one of the reasons why the Conservatives are clearly pressurising Labour on the SNP, at the moment at least, our expectation is it's probably going to be the SNP together with their Plaid and Green allies who are going to be the largest of the minority blocs in the House of Commons, and that if the polls are at where they are at the moment, no other combination of two parties that doesn't involve the SNP is going to get anybody past the 326 mark. That's why Ed Miliband, at the end of the day, yes, he doesn't want a coalition. Nicola Sturgeon, the SNP leader, doesn't want a coalition. But the reason why Ed Miliband is not ruling out having some kind of understanding, however vague and however sotto voce with the SNP, is that the truth is that might be his only route into power. And it also follows, by the way, the fact that the SNP have ruled out enabling David Cameron to stay in power, and the Tories reciprocated that, is at the moment at least one of the reasons why, irrespective of whether or not there are slightly more or fewer Conservative MPs than Labour ones, why Ed Miliband's chances of forming a government after May the 7th still look somewhat brighter than those of David Cameron's.
Right, but you could see Miliband leading the largest party, short of a majority.
Yes.
Cameron leading the second largest party, but with more votes. Now, who's got right on their side?
Well, most people would say that you play the game by the rules that's been set out. Indeed, if we go back to February 1974, the last time we had a minority government, indeed on that occasion the Labour Party got fewer votes across the country as a whole than the Conservatives did, but the Labour Party had 4 more seats. The Conservatives tried to do a deal with the Liberals, although that wouldn't have gotten a majority. Jeremy Thorpe said no, or was persuaded by his colleagues to say no, and Howard Wilson was effectively left to form an administration, even though he had fewer seats. The truth is, at the end of the day, once the election has been held, it's no longer votes in the country that matters, it's votes in the House of Commons that will decide, seats in the House of Commons, that will decide who in the end has the confidence of the House of Commons and therefore has the right to form the next administration.
Thank you very much. As always, fascinating. It's John Curtice, Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde, who officially knows everything.